Nolan, a successful but terribly lonely 27-year-old man, wandered the city streets on a cold winter night. He had been drinking too much at a local bar, trying to drown his sorrows in alcohol. His thoughts were lost in a whirlwind of dissatisfaction and melancholy. Despite his business success, with an enviable career and a bank account that many would desire, Nolan couldn't find happiness in his personal life. His romantic relationships had failed one after another, leaving him with a void that not all the money in the world could fill. Each step he took echoed in the empty streets, whispering echoes of his frustrations. He thought of his friends, many of them already married with children, while he remained alone, unable to maintain a stable relationship. "What have I done wrong?" he asked himself aloud, his breath mixed with the vapor of alcohol escaping his lips. "Why do they all leave me? Am I too harsh? No, a man has to be strong. But maybe I am harsh. Is that what scares women away?" His steps led him to a bridge, one that crossed a dark and deep river. Nolan stopped and looked at the water, an unsettling calm invading his mind. "Maybe I should jump," he thought, despair clutching at his heart. It would all end here. No more problems, no more loneliness. The river would take away all my pain. As he sank into his darkest thoughts, something caught his attention. A lone figure. A young woman was standing on the railing, a baby tied to her chest with a sling. Nolan watched in horror as she extended her arms, preparing to jump. Without thinking twice, he ran towards her. "Wait!" he shouted, reaching her just in time to grab her by the waist and pull her back. They both fell to the ground, the woman screaming and the baby crying. Nolan, his heart racing, slowly sat up, looking at the woman with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. The woman looked at him with eyes full of tears and despair. "What do you care?" she retorted, hugging the baby who was crying inconsolably. "I have nowhere to go. I have no one. No one is going to miss me." Nolan sighed, feeling a wave of compassion mixed with his own pain. "Look," he said more gently, "I may not have all the answers, but this is not the solution. Come on, at least let me help you tonight. You can't stay here." The woman looked at him suspiciously, her eyes assessing the sincerity in Nolan's face. "Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me." "Maybe because I know what it feels like to be desperate," Nolan admitted, "and because a baby shouldn't suffer for the decisions of adults. Come on, I'm not asking for anything in return. Just let me help you tonight." After a moment of hesitation, the woman slowly agreed. Nolan stood up and extended his hand to help her up. "Thank you," she murmured, holding the baby more firmly. "I'm Nolan," he introduced himself as they began walking down the deserted streets. "And you?" "Katherine," she replied softly. "And this is Carlos." The walk back to Nolan's apartment was silent, broken only by Carlos's occasional sobs and Katherine's sighs. Nolan's apartment was a perfect reflection of his bachelor life, messy and full of evidence of a routine without company. The entrance was cluttered with shoes and jackets, and the main living area displayed a combination of elegant but uncoordinated furniture, as if they had been acquired at different times of impulse and without a clear plan. Katherine entered cautiously, holding her baby, Carlos, firmly against her chest. Her eyes scanned the space, looking for any sign of danger. Nolan, noticing her reticence, tried to reassure her with a smile. "I know it doesn't look like the most welcoming place, but it's safe. I can offer you a place to spend the night, and tomorrow we can think about the next steps." Katherine slowly agreed, though the distrust remained in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Let's get some food and supplies for Carlos," Nolan suggested, heading for the door again. "There's a 24-hour store nearby." The walk to the store was silent, only broken by Carlos's soft sobs and Katherine's sighs. In the store, the curious glances of employees and other customers followed their every move. Nolan, unfazed, grabbed a basket and went straight to the baby food section. "Take what you need," he told Katherine. She, still in shock, timidly took a package of powdered milk. "This should be enough for now," she said. But Nolan shook his head. "No, take more. We don't know how long you'll need this. You also need diapers, wet wipes, everything Carlos might need." His tone was firm but kind, reflecting a responsibility that seemed new to him. Katherine looked at Nolan, trying to understand why a stranger was doing so much for her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of gratitude and skepticism. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she finally said as she filled the basket. Nolan looked her straight in the eye. "Because I've been in a dark place too. I had no one to help me when I needed it, and I don't want you and Carlos to go through that. We all need a little help sometimes." Upon reaching the checkout, the cashier and the security guard looked at them curiously, but Nolan paid without a word. They loaded up the bags and returned to the apartment. Nolan left the bags in the kitchen and turned to Katherine. "You can use this room," he said, pointing to a door to the right of the hallway. "It's not much, but it's something." Katherine entered the room, finding it simple but clean. She placed Carlos on the bed and began to prepare the powdered milk. Nolan, meanwhile, went to the kitchen and took out a can of cat food, calling to his cat, who appeared immediately, meowing hungrily. The night progressed slowly. Nolan retired to his room, giving Katherine and Carlos some space. As he lay down on his bed, the events of the night ran through his mind. He wondered how two lost souls had found each other that way, on the edge of despair. Katherine, after feeding Carlos, sat on the edge of the bed, watching her sleeping son. A wave of emotions overwhelmed her: relief, gratitude, and a slight hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Though still wary, she couldn't deny the feeling of security that Nolan provided, something that had been an unattainable luxury in her recent life. The next morning, Nolan got up early. He made coffee and toast, the aroma filling the small apartment. Katherine awoke to the smell of coffee and came out of the room, Carlos still asleep in the bed. Nolan greeted her with a smile. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" Katherine nodded. "Yes, thank you. I don't remember the last time I slept in a bed." Nolan poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat at the small kitchen table. "We can think about the next steps today," Nolan said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm not going to kick you out on the street. You can stay here until we find a more permanent solution." Katherine looked at Nolan, surprised by his generosity. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Nolan replied. "We all need help sometimes. Besides, Carlos needs a safe place, and so do you. We can work on this together." With that promise, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. Katherine began to relax, accepting Nolan's help, albeit cautiously. Nolan, for his part, felt a renewed sense of responsibility, a reason to get up each day. Although there was still much to be resolved, both found in that small kitchen a spark of hope, a new beginning in the midst of darkness. During the following days, the routine in Nolan's apartment slowly began to change. Nolan continued with his normal work days, although now with a different motivation. Katherine, meanwhile, stayed in the apartment, taking care of Carlos and beginning to adapt to her new reality. The initially tense and distrustful atmosphere began to soften. Each morning, Nolan would get up early to make breakfast. He wasn't an expert cook, but he made an effort to make toast, scrambled eggs, and coffee. Katherine always watched him silently from the doorway, still cautious but grateful. "Good morning," Nolan would say each time, with a smile that sought to dispel the tension. "Good morning," Katherine would reply softly, accepting a cup of coffee. For the first few days, their conversations were short and superficial, centered on everyday things like the weather or the news. But as the days passed, Katherine began to relax a little more. One afternoon, while Carlos was sleeping in his makeshift crib in the living room, Katherine decided to help Nolan with dinner. "Can I do anything?" she asked, watching as he tried to chop vegetables. Nolan looked up and smiled. "Sure, help is always welcome. Do you know how to make salads?" Katherine nodded and went to work. As they chopped and mixed ingredients, the conversation flowed more naturally. Nolan talked about his job at a technology company and how he had worked hard to get where he was. Katherine listened with interest, surprised by Nolan's dedication. "It seems like you've accomplished a lot," she commented. "Yes, but sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it," Nolan admitted, his tone serious. "Work, money, all that doesn't fill the void I feel." Katherine looked at Nolan, recognizing the sadness in his eyes. "I understand what you're saying," she replied softly. "I've felt that emptiness too." Nolan watched her, knowing there was more to her story than she let on. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral so as not to pressure her. Katherine hesitated, but something about Nolan's sincerity encouraged her to open up a little more. "I'm not ready to tell all," she said slowly, "but I can tell you it hasn't been easy. I've been through a lot of things I'd rather forget." Nolan nodded, respecting her privacy. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said calmly. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." As the days went by, Nolan continued to show his support in small ways, cooking, making sure there was enough food for Carlos, and providing a safe and stable environment. Katherine began to trust him more, appreciating his patience and kindness. One evening, after Carlos had finally fallen asleep, Nolan and Katherine sat on the couch, each with a cup of hot tea. "You know," Nolan began, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've always thought it was better to be alone than in bad company, but lately I've realized that loneliness can be just as painful." Katherine looked at him, her own thoughts reflected in Nolan's eyes. "Loneliness can be a very heavy burden," she replied, "especially when you feel like you have no one to turn to." Nolan nodded slowly. "Maybe right now we can be that company we both need," he suggested, his voice soft but full of sincerity. Katherine smiled for the first time since she had arrived at the apartment. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Thank you, Nolan, for everything you're doing for us." Nolan felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. "It's nothing," he replied, humbly. Each day, Katherine found more reasons to trust Nolan, while Nolan discovered in Katherine and Carlos a reason to move on, a purpose he had been searching for without knowing it. It was a quiet evening in Nolan's apartment. The soft light from the floor lamp illuminated the living room, creating an intimate and cozy atmosphere. Katherine, sitting on the couch with a cup of hot tea in her hands, watched Carlos sleep peacefully in his makeshift crib. Nolan, beside her, watched her silently, noticing the tension in her shoulders and the sadness in her eyes. Katherine finally felt it was time to open up. A mix of relief and fear overwhelmed her, but she knew she needed to share her story with Nolan, who had proven to be someone she could trust. "Nolan," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Nolan nodded, keeping his gaze soft and encouraging. "I'm here to listen, Katherine. Take your time." Katherine took a sip of tea, searching for the courage to continue. "I got married very young to a man named Luis. At first, everything seemed perfect. Luis was loving and protective, and I thought we had built a wonderful life together." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But things changed. Louise started drinking, and then came the drug addiction. Nolan listened attentively, without interrupting, allowing Katherine to vent her painful memories. The addiction transformed him into someone I didn't recognize. He became violent, and his anger always fell on me. Beatings, insults, threats. It all became commonplace. I tried to help him, but he didn't want to change. Katherine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of each word. When I found out I was pregnant, I had renewed hope. I thought that maybe the arrival of a baby could change him, that it could make Luis the man I met again. But it wasn't like that. In fact, things got worse. Nolan frowned, his heart clenching as he imagined the pain Katherine had endured. Carlos was born premature and with respiratory problems. We spent months in the hospital, and although Luis wasn't there to support us, I held on to the hope that things would get better. But they didn't, Katherine continued, her voice breaking. Luis continued to sink further into his addiction, and the violence only escalated. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't let Carlos grow up in that environment, surrounded by so much hate and suffering. Katherine's eyes welled up with tears as she remembered that night. I packed what little I could carry and fled with Carlos in my arms. We wandered the streets for days, not knowing where to go. I felt such despair that I thought the only way out was to end our lives. That's when I came to the bridge. Nolan, his eyes moist, reached out to hold Katherine's hand. I'm so sorry you went through all that, Katherine. No one should have to live through something like that. Katherine squeezed Nolan's hand gently, feeling a connection she hadn't experienced in a long time. Thank you for listening. It's been hard to keep all this inside. Nolan took a deep breath, trying to contain the rage he felt toward Luis and the pain for Katherine. I'm here for you and for Carlos. You don't have to go through this alone ever again. The room fell silent, broken only by the soft sound of Carlos's breathing. Katherine felt a mix of relief and vulnerability at having shared her story. She knew she still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. Nolan, for his part, felt more determined than ever to protect Katherine and Carlos. The darkness of Katherine's past only reinforced his desire to be a beacon of hope and stability for them. He had found a purpose he had been searching for without knowing it. That night, under the soft light of the lamp and the warmth of their mutual understanding, two wounded souls began to heal. As the hours passed, the night wore on, and the bond between them grew stronger. Katherine knew she had taken the first step toward healing, and Nolan silently vowed to be there for her every step of the way. In that small living room, under the dim light, the beginning of a new life was taking shape, a life full of promise and possibilities. Nolan's apartment had become a safe haven for Katherine and her son, Carlos. One morning, Nolan decided to take Katherine and Carlos for a walk in the nearby park. He wanted to show them a little of the city and, at the same time, strengthen their bond. As they walked, Carlos enthusiastically pointed out the ducks in the lake and the flowers along the path. "This place is beautiful," Katherine commented, watching Carlos play in the grass. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed something like this." Nolan smiled, happy to see Katherine a little more relaxed. "I'm glad you like it. I thought a change of scenery might be good for both of you." They sat down on a bench while Carlos continued playing. The conversation flowed naturally, and Nolan took the opportunity to learn more about Katherine. "Tell me, Katherine, what would you like to do in the future? Do you have any dreams or goals?" Katherine looked down, thoughtful. "I haven't thought about that in a long time," she admitted. "Before everything that happened, I wanted to be a teacher. I loved the idea of teaching and helping children learn. Nolan nodded. That's a beautiful dream. And I don't see why you couldn't go back to it at some point. You're strong, Katherine. You've been through a lot, but here you are, taking care of Carlos and facing each day with courage. Katherine looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. Thank you, Nolan. It's just that sometimes this all seems too good to be true. I find it hard to believe that someone would want to help me without expecting anything in return. Nolan took a deep breath, wanting his words to convey the sincerity of his feelings. I don't expect anything in return, Katherine. I want to help because I see in you and Carlos a family that needs support. And maybe, just maybe, I need something from you too. You've given me a reason to look beyond my own emptiness. A comfortable silence filled the park as Nolan's words sank in. Katherine began to see Nolan not just as a temporary savior, but as someone who could really become a part of her life. Days later, Nolan was preparing for a business trip. Before leaving, he sat down with Katherine to talk about what would happen while he was away. I'm going to be gone for a week, he explained. But I want you to know that this is your home too. I've left enough money for expenses, and the fridge is full. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call me. Katherine nodded, though her face showed a mixture of worry and relief. Thank you, Nolan. I'll do my best to keep everything in order. Nolan smiled, trying to instill confidence. I know you will. Besides, I've left some ground rules. Don't go into my office, and please make sure the cat doesn't run out of food. They both laughed softly, and for a moment everything seemed so normal, so everyday. Nolan leaned down and caressed the cheek of Carlos, who was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. See you soon, little one, he said with a smile. The day Nolan left, Katherine felt a mix of emotions. Nolan's absence left a kind of void, but it also gave her space to reflect on her situation. Every day, Katherine continued to take care of Carlos and the apartment. She began to feel more secure, more in control of her life. Katherine realized how much had changed in such a short time. The security of having a roof over her head, the peace of mind of knowing that Carlos was safe, and Nolan's constant kindness had begun to build a new hope in her heart. Nolan arrived at his apartment after his business trip, feeling a mixture of fatigue and anticipation. He opened the door and was met with a tidy home, much more so than he had left it. The cleanliness and the aroma of freshly cooked food pleasantly surprised him. He had barely taken a few steps inside when he heard a cheerful little voice. "Daddy!" Carlos ran towards him with open arms, swaying slightly but with an ear-to-ear grin. Nolan felt a pang in his heart, a mixture of joy and a profound emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. "Hey, champ," said Nolan, lifting Carlos into his arms and hugging him tightly. He looked up at Katherine, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching them with a warm smile. "Welcome back," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. Nolan noticed a change in Katherine. She seemed more confident, more grounded. "It's good to be back," Nolan replied, setting Carlos down but keeping a hand on his small back. "I see you've kept everything in perfect order." Katherine nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I wanted to make sure you had a welcoming home to come back to. Besides, Carlos and I have been fine here. It's been a time of rest and reflection." They sat down at the table for dinner, a simple but delicious meal that Katherine had prepared. During the meal, the conversation flowed naturally. Nolan shared anecdotes from his trip, while Katherine told him about Carlos's small achievements, like his first attempts to walk alone and his new words. "It's amazing how much a child can change in such a short time," Nolan commented, looking at Carlos with pride. Katherine smiled, nodding. Yes, and thanks to you, he's had a safe and stable environment to grow up in. After dinner, with Carlos asleep in his crib, Nolan and Katherine sat on the couch with cups of hot tea. The night was quiet, and the soft light from the lamp created an intimate atmosphere. Katherine, Nolan began, looking at his cup before looking up at her, I've been doing a lot of thinking during my trip. About us, about what we're building here. Katherine looked at him, her expression open and attentive. What have you been thinking? She asked softly. I've come to realize that what we have here, what we're building together, is more than I ever imagined for myself. I feel a connection with you and Carlos that goes beyond just living together. I care about your well-being more than I can say. Katherine nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting understanding and a spark of hope. It's been a big change for me, too. Finding this safe place with you has been a miracle. But sometimes I'm scared to think about the future. It all seems too good to be true. Nolan reached out and took Katherine's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of support and commitment. I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid. I'm here for you both, and I want to build a future together. Seeing Carlos call me Dad, it makes me realize that I want to be that figure for him. And I want to be someone you can trust, someone you can count on. Katherine squeezed his hand gently, a lone tear rolling down her cheek. Thank you, Nolan. I don't know how I could have made it without your help. But over time, I'm starting to see a different future. One full of hope. Nolan smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. So, how about we start planning that future? We can take it one day at a time, but I'd like to know what your dreams are, your desires. Katherine sighed, letting her mind wander through possibilities she had buried long ago. I always wanted to be a teacher, like I told you. And now, more than ever, I want to give Carlos a better life, full of love and opportunities. Nolan nodded in understanding. And I want to help you achieve that. Together, we can make this place a real home, a place where we can all grow and thrive. The night wore on, and with each word shared, the bond between Nolan and Katherine grew stronger. The promise of a future together was not just a vague idea, but a reality they were both willing to build. Through their fears and hopes, they found a new purpose, a reason to move forward. As the house fell silent for the night, Nolan realized that for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. And Katherine, watching Carlos sleep peacefully, knew she had found a place where they could finally flourish. The night was quiet in Nolan's apartment. Katherine was preparing dinner while Carlos played on the living room rug. Suddenly, an unsettling sound broke the calm. A dry, persistent cough coming from Carlos. Katherine's head snapped around, and her heart sank as she saw her son struggling to breathe. "Nolan!" she cried out in despair, rushing to Carlos and taking him in her arms. "It's happening again!" Nolan, who was reviewing some documents at the table, looked up in alarm. He immediately dropped everything and ran to Katherine. "What's wrong?" he asked, though he could already see the answer in Carlos's pale face and hear the sound of his ragged breathing. "It's his pneumonia," Katherine said, her voice trembling. "It's getting worse. We have to take him to the hospital now." Without wasting another second, Nolan grabbed his car keys and helped Katherine bundle Carlos up. They rushed out of the apartment and headed for the car. Nolan drove at full speed, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the city lights blurred past. "Hang on, little guy. We're almost there," Nolan murmured, as much to reassure Carlos as to calm his own nerves. Katherine, sitting in the back seat with Carlos in her arms, tried to remain calm, but the panic in her eyes was evident. "Please, please hold on," she whispered, gently stroking her son's head. They reached the hospital in a matter of minutes, but to them it seemed like an eternity. Nolan slammed on the brakes in front of the emergency room entrance and rushed inside with Carlos, followed closely by Katherine. "We need help," Nolan shouted, his voice echoing through the waiting area. Immediately, a group of doctors and nurses hurried towards them. They took Carlos from Nolan and Katherine's arms, placing him on a stretcher and rushing him into the emergency room. "We're going to do everything we can," assured one of the nurses, before disappearing through the swinging doors. Katherine slumped into a chair, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. Nolan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "He'll be okay," he said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "Carlos is strong, and he's in good hands." The hours passed slowly, every minute heavy with tension. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his expression grave. "Carlos's condition is critical," he informed them. "His pneumonia has progressed rapidly, and he has fluid in his lungs. He needs immediate surgery to drain the fluid." Katherine let out a heart-wrenching sob and collapsed into Nolan's arms, unable to bear the news. Nolan held her tightly, his own eyes filling with tears. "Is there any other option?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor shook his head. "It's the only way to save him. We have to proceed right away." Nolan nodded, though his heart was breaking. "Do whatever it takes," he said with determination. As they wheeled Carlos away for surgery, Katherine and Nolan remained in the waiting room, clinging to each other. Time seemed to stand still, and the silence became unbearable. Katherine burrowed into Nolan's chest, her tears soaking his shirt. "I can't lose him, Nolan. I can't." "You won't lose him," Nolan replied, though fear choked him. "Carlos is a fighter. He'll get through this." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor returned. His expression was more relaxed, and Nolan and Katherine shot to their feet. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "Carlos is stable, but he'll need constant care and monitoring in the coming weeks." Katherine let out a gasp of relief, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. Nolan held her up, feeling a knot in his throat finally come undone. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. They entered the recovery room, where Carlos lay sleeping, hooked up to various monitors but breathing more easily. Katherine approached and kissed his forehead softly, while Nolan stood beside her, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. That night, as they sat together beside Carlos's bed, Nolan and Katherine shared a moment of silent understanding. The fear and anguish of the past few hours had strengthened their bond, and now, more than ever, they knew they would face anything together. As they watched Carlos sleep, they both felt a renewed sense of hope. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but together they were stronger. The crisis had passed, and with it, a new stage in their relationship had begun, one founded on love and resilience. The hospital had become a second home for Nolan and Katherine. For days, they took turns staying by Carlos's bedside, monitoring his every breath, every little movement. Time seemed to pass slowly, but it also allowed Katherine to observe Nolan in a way she had never been able to before. Nolan was meticulous in his care for Carlos. Every time he fed him or adjusted his blankets, he did so with a tenderness that touched Katherine deeply. He was not just an efficient businessman, but also a loving and attentive caregiver. His gentle touch and calming voice had a soothing effect on Carlos, and Katherine couldn't help but feel profoundly grateful. On one of those long nights, as Carlos slept, Katherine sat next to Nolan in the small hospital waiting room. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "Nolan," she finally said, breaking the silence, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Nolan looked at Katherine, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fatigue and affection. "You don't need to thank me, Katherine. I do it because I want to, because you both mean so much to me." Katherine nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "When we met on that bridge, I never imagined I would find someone like you. You've changed our lives." Nolan took her hand and squeezed it gently. "And you've changed mine. Before I met you, my life was empty, focused only on work. Now, I have a reason to get up every morning." The days in the hospital continued, but finally the time came when Carlos was discharged. They returned to Nolan's apartment, which now felt much more like a home. Katherine noticed the small changes, the photos on the walls, Carlos's toys neatly arranged in a corner, and the warmth that permeated every corner. One evening, as Carlos slept in his crib, Nolan and Katherine sat together on the couch. The silence of the night provided an intimate space for a heartfelt conversation. "Katherine," Nolan began, "I've been thinking a lot about our future. I want you to know that I want to be a part of your lives permanently." Katherine looked at him, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, although she already sensed the answer. "I want us to get married," Nolan said firmly but gently. "I want to adopt Carlos and be his father in every way. I want us to be a family." Katherine felt a surge of emotions. Nolan's offer was everything she had dreamed of, but she also knew she had to be honest with him. "Nolan, I've been through a lot. My past isn't easy to forget, and I'm afraid to trust and be hurt again." Nolan looked into her eyes, holding her gaze with unwavering sincerity. "I know, and I'm not asking you to forget your past. I just want you to know that I'm here to build a future with you, one where you can trust and feel safe. I won't let you down, Katherine." Katherine felt her defenses finally crumble. She nodded, slowly, allowing the tears to flow freely. "Yes, Nolan, I want that too. I want to be a family." They embraced, feeling like all the pieces were finally falling into place. In that moment, they both knew they had found what they had both been searching for: true love and a sense of belonging. The following days were filled with shared dreams and plans. They talked about the wedding, about how they wanted to raise Carlos, and about the small and big moments they hoped to share together. Nolan's transformation, from a lonely, career-driven man to a devoted partner and father figure, was complete. Katherine also felt transformed. The scared and broken woman who had arrived on that bridge that night was becoming someone strong, confident, and full of hope. Her journey of redemption was underway, and with Nolan by her side, she knew they could face any challenge. One afternoon, as they were walking through the park with Carlos, Nolan stopped and looked at Katherine with a smile. "You know, this is just the beginning. We have a whole life ahead of us, full of possibilities." Katherine smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in years. "Yes, Nolan, and I'm ready to live it with you." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink, they walked hand in hand towards a bright future, filled with love. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of excitement and activity. Carlos, finally recovered under the attentive care of Katherine and Nolan, ran through the apartment, full of energy and laughter. The transformation in his health was a reflection of the new life the family was building together. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. The park where they had decided to get married was adorned with colorful flowers and simple but elegant decorations. Close friends and new family members began to arrive, filling the place with an atmosphere of love and joy. Nolan, dressed in an elegant suit, stood next to his best man, anxiously awaiting Katherine's arrival. His heart pounded in his chest, aware of the magnitude of the moment. He looked around, seeing the smiling faces of those who had witnessed his journey, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Then the music began to play, and everyone turned towards the flower-lined aisle. Katherine appeared, walking slowly towards Nolan, with Carlos holding her hand. Her white dress shimmered in the sunlight, and her smile radiated happiness. Nolan's eyes filled with tears of emotion as he watched the woman who had transformed his life. The ceremony was beautiful and moving. The vows they exchanged reflected not only the love they shared, but also the promise of a future filled with hope and mutual support. When it came time for Nolan's words, he took a moment to breathe deeply and look at Katherine and Carlos. "I never imagined my life could change the way it has since the day we met on that bridge," Nolan began, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "Katherine, you and Carlos have given me a reason to live, a purpose I never knew I needed. Today, I promise to be the husband and father you both deserve. Forever." Katherine, with tears glistening in her eyes, took Nolan's hand. "Nolan, from the moment I met you, I knew there was something special about you. You have been our savior, our protector, and our friend. Today I feel like the luckiest woman in the world to become your wife. I promise to love and support you every step of the way." The guests couldn't hold back their tears, moved by the sincerity and love that filled the air. But Katherine wasn't finished. With a shy but radiant smile, she addressed the guests. "There is something else I want to share with all of you," she said, looking into Nolan's eyes. "Nolan and I are not only starting a new life together as husband and wife, but we are also expecting a new member of our family. I'm pregnant." A murmur of surprise and joy ran through the guests. Nolan, stunned and overjoyed, embraced Katherine, his eyes filled with tears of happiness. "This is a miracle," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. After the ceremony, the celebration continued with laughter, music, and dancing. Friends and family toasted the happiness of the newly married couple, sharing stories and memories. Carlos's adoption was formalized, and he, with his new family, moved among the guests, happy and loved. Life after the wedding found a harmonious rhythm filled with love. Nolan and Katherine, now expecting their second child, found in each day an opportunity to strengthen their bond and build a home filled with joy and support. Carlos's laughter filled the house, and the evenings were spent in heartfelt conversations about dreams and future plans. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Nolan took Katherine's hand and kissed it softly. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, looking at the stars. "Yes," Katherine replied, resting her head on Nolan's shoulder. "And every step has been worth it. I can't imagine a better life than this, with you and our children." Nolan smiled, feeling a deep peace. "Our love has healed wounds I thought could never be healed. We have found a strength within ourselves that we never knew we had. And this is just the beginning." As the night went on, they stayed there, under the starry sky, secure in the knowledge that love and compassion truly can transform lives. Together, they looked forward to a future full of promise and possibility, knowing that no matter what came their way, they would face it as a strong and united family. And so, Nolan and Katherine's journey, which began in a moment of despair, blossomed into a story of love and redemption, showing that there is always hope for those who dare to believe and strive for a new beginning. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. for this incredible story of love and redemption. I hope you enjoyed this journey as much as I did sharing it with you. Life can be unpredictable and sometimes very hard. But this story reminds us that there is always hope and that true love can heal the deepest wounds. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming heartwarming and inspiring stories. Also, activate the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we upload new content. And remember, if you know of any real-life story that deserves to be told, leave it in the comments or send us a message. We love hearing and sharing those stories that touch the heart and can make a difference in the lives of others. See you next time, and remember, love and hope are all around us. We just need to open our hearts to find them. See you in the next video.